How does a political debate on a college campus end with a high-powered rifle? On September 10th, 2025, that question became a horrifying reality. Charlie Kirk, the vocal conservative activist, was fatally shot during a Prove Me Wrong event at Utah Valley University. The FBI has confirmed it was a targeted attack, and a manhunt is underway. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was the culmination of a deeply ingrained, uniquely American problem. To understand how we got here, we have to unpack the legal, cultural, and political systems that make tragedies like this not just possible, but predictable. So, how did we get here? The story of America's modern gun crisis really takes shape with a fundamental shift in our laws. For decades, the Second Amendment was understood in relation to state-organized militias, but then came 2008. The Supreme Court's District of Columbia v. Heller decision radically reinterpreted it, ruling that individual citizens have a constitutional right to carry firearms for self-defense. But what's fascinating is the origin of this modern interpretation. Back in the 1960s, it was the Black Panther Party for self-defense who first seized on the Second Amendment's ambiguity to legally arm themselves against police brutality. You'd think that would be celebrated as a defense of liberty, right? Nope. California quickly passed legislation to restrict gun ownership. But here's the kicker. The NRA, which was largely focused on gun safety before this, suddenly adopted this aggressive, individualistic interpretation. They reshaped public discourse, and by 2008, the narrative had been completely flipped. It became about fighting a tyrannical government or defending yourself from a perceived threat. But let's talk about what actual tyrannical governments do with guns. And this is what struck me as being very disturbing. The president, Donald Trump, immediately blamed radical left political violence, vowing revenge. You've heard the argument that guns are necessary to fight tyranny, but history tells the exact opposite story. The Dictator's Playbook shows that tyrants like Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler didn't rise to power by fighting an armed populace. They consolidated power by strategically disarming any group they saw as a threat. Mussolini, in a chilling parallel to today, used assassination attempts as the perfect pretext to disarm his political opponents and seize absolute control of the state. This historical lesson raises an uncomfortable question following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. With the death of a prominent ally being blamed on political violence, the administration now has a powerful justification to act in the name of security. We have to consider the possibility that the president could follow that same playbook, using this tragedy as the catalyst to restrict firearm access, not for public safety, but to neutralize perceived political threats. The ultimate irony would be if Charlie Kirk, a fervent Second Amendment advocate, became the martyr whose death is used to justify the very gun control he spent his life fighting against. Now, let's pivot from that history back to the reality on the ground in America today. While we talk about guns preventing tyranny, our daily life is defined by a different kind of terror. We're talking about trauma surgeons like Jessica Beard, who, even as she saves one young person from a gunshot wound, gets 2 more alerts on her phone. This isn't an anomaly, it's a daily reality in hospitals across the country. The science and sociology of this crisis are clear. Neuroscience reveals a developmental gap between impulse and self-control in young men, a vulnerability that easy firearm access turns into a lethal threat. This is compounded by cultural pressures that socialize boys to express anger instead of vulnerability, where a gun becomes a twisted symbol of masculine power. Yet despite these clear drivers of violence and overwhelming public support for reform, the system is defined by a deep political paralysis, so profound that even the tragic loss of 20 elementary school children at Sandy Hook was not enough to pass meaningful legislation. To make matters worse, for decades, the Dickey Amendment effectively censored federally funded research into gun violence, crippling our ability to collect crucial data. We were flying blind by design. And that brings us back to that sunny day in Utah. With all this context, the legal framework, the historical irony, perceived threats by President Trump, and the political gun legislative failures, let's look again at what happened. Let's pull up this piece from CBS News. Charlie Kirk's shooter remains at large. Here's what we know about the search for a suspect. A search was continuing Thursday for the person who shot and killed Charlie Kirk at an event at Utah Valley University. Kirk, a prominent conservative activist who co-founded the right-wing advocacy group Turning Point USA, was 31. CBS News lays out the stark reality. Charlie Kirk, 31 years old, a prominent conservative activist having lost his life, shot at his own event. A prove me wrong debate where he challenged others now ended in the most brutal final way. This isn't just a political assassination, as the Utah governor called it. It's a tragic, ironic echo of the very rhetoric Kirk himself championed, CBS continued. Officials took 2 people into custody in the wake of the shooting, but later said neither was tied to the shooting and both were released. This isn't just a national headline, it's a living nightmare for a community, for law enforcement, and for a family left shattered. This isn't some foreign terrorist, this is one of our own, someone shaped by the very American gun culture we've allowed to fester. It reinforces the uncomfortable truth the violence is internal. CBS News also commented on the chilling detail that the suspect was college age, someone who blended in. FBI Special Agent in Charge Robert Bowles said Thursday that investigators recovered a high-powered bolt-action rifle, which they believe was the weapon used in the assassination, the kind of weapon Kirk fiercely defended the right to own. The irony is absolutely devastating. While authorities have not specified a potential motive for the shooting, Mason said they believe it was a targeted attack toward one individual. Only one shot was fired, and Kirk was the only victim, according to the commissioner. But what if the blame lies not just with an individual shooter, but with the very ideology that allowed that rifle to be so easily obtained? What if it's the bitter fruit of an America where gun-related fatalities are simply the price of freedom and part of liberty, as Charlie Kirk himself once stated? By his own logic, this tragedy is an acceptable cost of the Second Amendment.